Very good. And if I could throw to food security, which you brought up, I just wonder, again, the level of discussion around Brand Australia. We heard earlier today about New Zealand and their success. What were the discussion points about, well, if we don't have a global food processor and if we're somewhat undercooked, so to speak, how do we get out of this? How do we become more opportunistic? Was there some discussion in your group on that?
Yeah, I guess the comparison that came from New Zealand is how they actually engaged and were able to take further opportunities and identify opportunities in other countries. I mean, New Zealand is fairly small, and obviously if they want to supply the world in the dairy industry or other industries, they would have to then liaise with other countries for that. Possibly there's a lack of engagement from Australia to believe that it should partner with other countries instead of finding itself as a competitor with other countries in those sectors, to take advantage of this competitiveness and become a partner and interact more, just like New Zealand did, in this case with Fronteira, and be able to utilize resources from other countries to actually improve their productivity and be more successful as a global player.
And my final question is in regard to education. You said that it was your group's view that the strongest connections could come through business. Yeah. And again, could you just share with us a little bit more detail about that? How would that work? What would be the power of those business relationships? How would we increase respect and shared values, etc., if business were the front runner on that process?
I don't think we discarded the idea that we must understand the cultures that you're doing business with quite deeply before you actually approach them. That's one feature that is quite necessary for international businesses to succeed. What we were probably trying to say is that we don't believe that the most important issue for international businesses to succeed is the language, but we do believe that Australia has already quite a good network of students that come here from other countries. As president of the Brazil Chamber, I have noticed in the last couple of years the strength that this student relationship with Australia has improved the business relations, because usually then they come back and they build these relationships further and it turns into business. So the education sector, the languages sector, and what we have to offer here for foreign students can be quite a good seed for the future business relationships that can be created through the education that we offer here. And for Australians, I think it's harder because it's very difficult for us to see the opposite happening. Australians studying in different universities throughout Middle East or Asia or Latin America because of the language. So it's easier for us to actually build those relationships utilizing the resources, educational resources, and that we have already here. And Australia is an international place for students, not just for language, but higher level education.
Thanks, Paul. And Cristina, likewise, as we asked Neil earlier, what would be your single point that you'd like to really focus on if we were to go forward?
Well, my personal point of view in a summit is that for Australia, obviously geographically and for other reasons, it's very, very important to be a very strong player in this region and a very strong partner of Asian countries, especially China, as a major emerging market, and maybe liaise with countries that have benefited from the Chinese, economic development, like Brazil and other countries in Latin America or in the Middle East or wherever they are in Europe, to actually be able to be even a strong player, because even though Australia has resources, there are some issues of cost here, manufacturing costs. There's issue with scarcity of water for the agribusiness sector, and to actually liaise with other stronger agribusiness or energy countries that have a strong sector in energy would make Australia a stronger player for the Asia market, definitely.
Terrific. Thanks so much. Let's move now to the third group, and the co-chair director of GHD, Muntisov, is with us. Michael, take us through the points that you decided upon after discussions.
Sure, thanks, Beverley. Perhaps I'll start with answering the question that I think I'm going to get at the end, which is the
Most important.
the most important point. We raised a whole range of issues through the course of our lunch. Most of them, I think, would fall under the first category, the interconnectedness of people and cultural literacy, and that was a point that Ken Henry raised this morning. It's been raised several times, and many of the examples and ideas that were brought up in our lunch session, I think, fall under this category. So this, I think, in our case, would certainly be the most important one. So the question, cultural literacy, the question came up, what does it actually mean? And it was, I think there was general agreement that it certainly goes beyond the issue of language, and it does involve cultures, and we do have many different cultures in Asia. It's not a single culture, and that needs to be, I think, well understood. There was a view put that, in fact, our education system here is not addressing this issue of understanding culture, the Asian culture. It's not doing that adequately. So one of the aspects of what is cultural literacy probably came out in some of the discussions that weren't under the banner of cultural literacy per se. But so, for example, I think there was a view that we needed to understand some of those critical issues that the Asian nations are facing and will have to deal with. And there were quite a number of examples that were given during our session. So, for example, if I could touch on a few of these, one was the demographic issue that China is going to face in 2050, where potentially 60% of the population will be aged and will not be in the workforce. So how is that going to be dealt with, and what are the issues that does that bring to China? We need to be sensitive to that and understand that, and again, be conscious of that. Again, in China, there was another example of, this is more technical, but understanding how the distribution of water in China sits compared to the distribution of population. So 80% of the water is in southern China and 80% of the population is in northern China. So how is that going to be dealt with? And understanding that is going to be important from our perspective. Another example along those lines was the potential divide that could occur in India between North and South India, very much precipitated by the significantly different fertility rates that occur in North and South India, and that's going to lead to some demographic issues in India. I'm not sure if we understand what they are, but an understanding of those potential issues and monitoring those is going to be very important as part of, if I've lumped it in under cultural literacy. We also talked about building on what Michael Yao talked about this morning, which was this tremendous resource that we already have and maybe we don't utilise, and that resource is the alumni of Asian students who've come to Australia and got their degrees. Some have stayed on, some have moved back. Also, we, I think, do a very good job at, let's call it training, emerging politicians or leaders, bringing them to Australia, various delegations, bringing them to Australia, showing them systems, processes that we have. That's all great, but then we talked about, in terms of the cultural literacy piece, the desirability of actually advancing the progress towards our greater understanding by getting more younger Australians, we're talking 20 to 30 plus people, to live and work in Asia, right? And there was a couple of examples that came up in our group of a couple of programs. They sounded a little bit relatively small, but imagine if we could have a very extensive program where we had people in their 20s or 30s, future leaders, living and working in Asia and really gaining a fantastic understanding of what the culture is there. It would give us a tremendous advantage, I think, if we got that if that just became business as usual in the way we did things. That would be tremendous. The other thing about, again, lumped into cultural literacy was the understanding the changes in society. And there was a really interesting example came up in our group that talked about China, the changes in China over the last 15 years even. And this example was, and this particular person has worked in China over that period. 15 years ago, they observed that there was absolutely no interest in environmental impact of certain development. Development was king. In other words, we had to develop, we had to do things, we had to stimulate the economy and improve, or in an economic sense, our well-being. And environment was a very, very low down on the priority order. And he gave an example of last year being in China when there was an incident at a factory in which there was some spillage and damage, environmental damage, and in fact in this city there were demonstrations, public demonstrations. Now one could imagine that would never have occurred 15 years ago. There were public demonstrations to the extent that in fact the government did close down that factory in response. So there's some examples that were discussed in our group that we've lumped in under cultural literacy. And as I say, I think probably our most prominent point. The second point there we've called interconnectedness of knowledge. And this relates to the fact that many of the things we are talking about are intimately connected. And we heard about a really interesting pilot's farming scheme that really illustrated the importance of understanding and knowledge across these issues. And what was going to be important there was an understanding of water, clearly, for an understanding of soils, an understanding of environmental factors, an understanding of diversity, and clearly in a farming setting, an understanding of agricultural practices. All those things are interrelated, and so again, it's the interconnectedness of that knowledge and the need to have that knowledge. And if we can have that, gain that knowledge, have that knowledge, in many cases we have that. I mean, that's a farming example. There's probably other examples in other industry. If we can leverage that sort of knowledge into Asia, we get 1,000-fold benefit for the global community. Okay, it's not just Australia, but Asia. And then the final point we put under interconnectedness of systems. And this is a lot to do with, a little bit similar to the previous one, but a lot to do with holistic thinking. And one of the things that came up is that, again, some of the issues that we've talked about, in fact, virtually all of them, are connected in this holistic world. So food security can't be looked at on its own. It's linked very strongly, for example, to water. And we hear about, and we all know about the water-energy nexus. So those are two things that are linked. Urban development, that's linked. How that proceeds affects energy, water, and environment. Transport, and there's community and social issues. So all of these things are interconnected in a holistic way.